Good evening. My name is Ravi Ramamurthy. I'm Director of the Center for Emerging Markets at Northeastern University. Welcome to the second in our series called the China Insight series. I think many of you were here for the previous talk by Professor Michael Enright. This is the second in the series, and it's going to focus on China's major economic initiatives. I think many of us have heard about some of these initiatives, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, the Made in China 2025 initiative, or the Digital Silk Road Initiative. So Professor Enright will be covering all these topics. And without further ado, I want to just briefly remind you that Professor Enright is the Pierre Choueiri Family Professor of Global Business at the Damore McKim School of Business and a faculty associate of the Center for Emerging Markets. He has extensive experience in Asia Pacific. He's a noted expert on China, and he's done extensive teaching, research, consulting in that part of the world. I'm going to now turn it over to Michael. Michael, take it away.
Thank you, Ravi. Let me just get loaded up here. First, I would like to thank Ravi and the Northeastern Center for Emerging Markets for hosting and sponsoring the event, and I'd like to thank you all as well for coming. As Ravi indicated, this is the second in our China Insight series, focusing on China's major economic initiatives. That's me. I joined the faculty at Northeastern this past July after having spent the previous 24 years basically on the ground in China, mostly working with major multinational companies on their Asian and China strategies, as well as teaching at the University of Hong Kong. And if you're interested in some of my publications, those are easy to Google. What we'll focus on tonight, again, as Ravi indicated, is China's major economic initiatives. Because China launched over the last 20 and really accelerated the process over the last 10 years that really promised to reshape the world economy. And it's critical to understand these initiatives and the strategy of which they are part if we're going to be able to craft the right responses for this new environment. Now, the first thing that I'll focus on, however, is that these major economic initiatives are parts of a comprehensive, integrated strategic approach towards development. And in fact, one of the shortcomings of many views of these initiatives is that they tend to look at them on a piecemeal basis, one initiative at a time, often focusing on whether particular targets are going to be met or not, and missing the point that the overall approach, when we take all the initiatives combined, is unprecedented in scale, scope, and resources employed. We also have to take a step back and look at, in broad brush, some of China's national goals, which include, by 2021, the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, for China to be a moderately prosperous nation. It is already a middle-income nation by World Bank standards. And by 2049, the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China, for China to be a global manufacturing, cyber, and science and technology innovation superpower. So these are, very broad, very large background goals. Now, one of the key things is that the combination of initiatives that I'll talk about are having and will have a fundamental impact on the world economic order, whether or not specific targets or timelines are hit. In other words, these are processes that are ongoing, and they're processes that are going to make change, however we want to look at it, however we want to measure it. Now, this overall approach has a number of interlocking components. The first one being state direction and support. And the state support helps provide China with the skills and capabilities required for development, the needed infrastructure, but also direct and indirect financial support, and policies that at times can skew the playing fields to promote China's development, and also provides direction for all actors in the economy. So when the Chinese government comes out with a major economic initiative, it is not only a signal to government agencies, it's a signal to virtually every other actor in the economy, be it private sector companies, be it banks, be it venture capitalists, private equity, that these are growth areas that China is going to support. Then at the other end, I say here, trade and investment agreements, which China engages in part to provide a higher level of certainty to foreign companies and governments in dealing with China, but also to provide market access to Chinese companies, goods and services, and also dispute resolution mechanisms that can be used sometimes to advantage. And although my separation is somewhat artificial, I tend to separate the major initiatives into either development programs, which are primarily focused to development within China, and what I call international projections, which are China's very specific efforts to project economic and non-economic power, influence, etc., beyond China's borders. And again, the development programs, these are the flagship programs, often based on years of research before they're announced, coordinated at the center, many with a long-term focus. And the international projects tend to build international cooperation, aid in mutual development, and then again, project China's capabilities, leverage relationships, etc. And some of the areas in terms of state direction support are science and technology roadmaps and the educational and research support that goes with that, infrastructure support, financial, regulatory policy. I already mentioned that. On the other extreme, trade and investment agendas, we have, of course, China's membership in the World Trade Organization, the free trade agreements that it has signed, the bilateral investment treaties, such as the one it just signed with the European Union, and then more recently, and I'll move out of the way, RCEP, the new Asia-Pacific free trade area. And then within the development programs and international projections, there are many. And I've just listed a few of the major ones here, and we won't have time to go through all of these this evening. But just in terms of some background, the ones that we won't focus on today have been staggering in scale and scope. The Go Global initiative announced in the year 2000 helped push the stock of outward foreign direct investment from China from 28 billion US dollars in the year 2000 to basically 2 trillion US dollars by 2019. The digitalization Internet Plus plan, which really has taken the first steps. The policy announced in 2016 was the update of the 2006 plan, which has helped China create the infrastructure that has supported developments such as going from 160 million online shoppers in 2010 to 782 million by 2020. Or getting to 890 million mobile payment users in 2020, up from 0 in 2003. And we're not even going to talk about those further this evening. Or China's initiatives to project its financial power and resources internationally, extending the Union Pay system to over 170 countries, trying to put in place an international payment system to either rival or eventually replace the SWIFT system, and China being a leader in central bank digital currency research and pilot projects. Or urbanization, where urbanization was 45% of China's population in 2010, expected to be 60% by 2030, a difference of over 200 million people, with well over $180 billion just in urban infrastructure investment expected per year over the next 10 years. And those are the ones we're not even going to focus on this evening. So instead, let me dive into some of the larger and better known initiatives. The first is the Belt and Road Initiative that was announced in 2013. And this was designed in part to address a well-known infrastructure gap. The Asian Development Bank, for example, estimated that there would be a need for 26 trillion US dollars worth of infrastructure investment in developing Asia from 2016 to 2030, but only a portion of that would actually happen, that there would be a huge unmet need for infrastructure. And China had already, well before 2013, been investing in transportation and infrastructure to secure oil and other natural resource supplies, pipelines towards Kazakhstan, port in Pakistan, etc. And China had already been expanding economic planning and political ties to much of the developing world. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative to date is largely financed by China through state banks, through development banks, through companies, and also through direct investment funds. And there are a range of specialized financial institutions, such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank, the Silk Road Investment Funds, etc., that are operating in this space, in addition to the commercial banks and other Chinese financial entities. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative has a number of goals. Among the stated goals are to achieve policy coordination across the relevant countries, to build the infrastructure to connect the countries, to support trade and investment flows and financial integration, to foster better relations and cultural and interpersonal ties throughout the Belt and Road Initiative countries, and also connection, cooperation, and integration so that China and Europe can be two engines of global growth on the opposite ends of the Eurasian continent. But in addition to the stated goals, there are also a number of unstated but just as important goals. One is to enhance China's energy security. China is energy deficient. It is importing a large portion of its energy usage, and a lot of that comes through sea lanes that potentially could be interdicted if there were ever conflicts. But also to expand the markets for Chinese industries and the competitiveness of Chinese companies by having them be suppliers and agents of development through this Belt and Road Initiative. It also is designed to enhance China's economic and geopolitical influence, shifting the balance within Asia, in part by recreating the notion of a middle kingdom in which all roads lead to Beijing. Now, all of these, are quite, in a sense, reasonable and logical, as China, an emerging power, is looking to increase its influence, its connections around the world, just as any other nation would. Now, there are, and I won't go into all of the details, obviously, there are 7 major economic corridors that are now under investigation or active development. The one going around towards the North Pole, that's sort of more under investigation than active development. But we have both sea and land routes, which again, primarily are to connect Asia with Asia, Asia with Europe, Asia with Africa in terms of trade, in terms of facilitating investment, but also very much to facilitate natural resource flows within the area. And as of January of this year, there were 140 countries, excuse me, that had signed memorandums of understanding with the Belt and Road Initiative. We can see that the largest number is actually Europe and Central Asia, following Sub-Saharan Africa, which has the most on around. So this is becoming a major global initiative with major global participation. Now, just some of the milestones. China has already, since the announcement in 2013, funded roughly 1.9 trillion US dollars for Belt and Road Initiative projects, and another 2+ trillion for over 1,500 related projects. Now, this is not like direct transfer or equity. The largest share of this is actually in loans that are supposed to be paid back through the proceeds of the infrastructure investments over the next many years. There are over 200 cooperation documents in place with the 140 countries. There have been already over 100 economic and trade zones set up and built in BRI countries, which now support over 300,000 jobs. The trade flows are coming up to nearly $1 trillion US dollars a year between China and the Belt and Road Initiative countries, etc. And although we would have, of course, read or heard in the press of a number of the difficulties that the initiative has had over its first several years, many of the important projects are either concluding, making solid progress, and there's more in the offing. And one of the interesting things is that if we look at what Belt and Road Initiative has done in terms of China's international outreach, we see that since the announcement in most of the years that actually China's outbound investment and international construction contracts has skewed more and more towards Belt and Road Initiative countries. This, again, sort of complicated chart, but statistics pulled together by the American Enterprise Institute and Heritage Foundation show roughly where the money is going. And what we see is that in terms of sectors, that energy is by far the leading sector in terms of receiving Belt and Road Initiative investment. This is direct investment in energy sources, natural gas fields off of Myanmar, for example, and also for energy pipelines and related logistics. The second leading one is transport. If China and other Belt and Road Initiative countries are going to develop those 7 corridors, that's a massive undertaking in ports, in highways, in railways. But Belt and Road has gone much, much farther than that to, for example, funding the opening of, or the development and subsequent opening of the first metro line in Lahore, or highways in Indonesia and metro systems elsewhere. And we see that the third main sectoral destination of funds is real estate. And that's not buying apartment buildings or office blocks. A lot of it is actually investment in industrial parks, as we saw before. Well over 100 economic development zones with industrial parks have already been constructed under the Belt and Road Initiative. And in terms of geographic distribution, we can see that East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and West Asia are the main destinations. So again, connecting up China so far mostly to relatively near neighbors. Now, if we look at some of the countries that are receiving Chinese investment and funds, we see that there are Belt and Road Initiative countries and then other countries not involved. And we see that among the Belt and Road Initiative countries that Pakistan, Singapore, Indonesia, Russia, Malaysia are the leaders. Pakistan, I'll go into in a moment. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is the largest set of projects under Belt and Road at the moment. But Singapore receiving investment for ports, and also increasingly Chinese companies setting up Singapore as their Southeast Asian management center. Indonesia, a lot of infrastructure related to Indonesia's natural resource wealth. Russia, of course, a major pathway for transport corridors going from China to Europe. Malaysia, both resources and railway and highway investments, eventually connecting up the southwestern port of China with ASEAN. And I also include non-BRI countries just to show that the US, Britain have still been the largest destinations over the period of time since the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative of Chinese investment. And that's going for other purposes. That's going for technology, for market access, other initiatives that China has had. But if we look at the list of countries in Belt and Road receiving sizable investments, a lot of that is resource-based, infrastructure-based, transport-based. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is the most ambitious set of projects. It includes multiple highways. It includes the port of Gwadar, which is now up and running. It includes pipelines to take oil from the Middle East going into Gwadar and then being run up and through into China. It includes industrial parks. It includes subway systems. It is a national development program for Pakistan. Pakistan is supposed to be paying for this 90% with government debt, so these are not direct transfers. But the initial price tag was estimated at 46 billion US dollars for the program. That's now around 87 billion. And there have been issues with some of the projects. Some of them have been canceled. A few have been delayed. A number of them have been financially restructured. But the key thing about the program is it continues. And it continues to initiate new projects, to complete existing projects, and it will potentially transform Pakistan and its economy. There are a number of issues that have emerged with the BRI and responses. Most of the funding still comes from Chinese sources. Some of the projects have had poor economics. There have been some pushbacks because of the debt burden that some of the countries have run into through BRI projects. And quite frankly, I attribute those more to poor planning and execution of some of these projects where the due diligence on determining financial viability have not been worked out in advance. But what's happening is that China is adjusting. There is now much greater scrutiny of Belt and Road Initiative projects than there was just a few years ago. The sharp pencils have come out. The Chinese side is running the numbers, even if the other side isn't. Projects are being restructured. There's an increase in emphasis on capacity building by Chinese entities training the counterparts in order for those investments to be absorbed and operated more effectively. Moving on, again, because these are many and many large initiatives. The Made in China 2025 initiative. This was announced after a 2-year effort, and it's really a blueprint for China's industrial development. The background is that in China's view, it's a leading manufacturer, but not an advanced one, not like Germany or Switzerland or the US. That R&D and indigenous innovation were lacking, that China's relied too much on imported technology, that it has to do better if it's going to escape the middle income trap. And again, a quote from one of the underlying documents, the foundation in China for science and technology innovation not firm, indigenous innovation still weak. Fundamentally, that means that China is reliant on others for leading technologies. There are 10 main industries targeted by this program, 50 sub-industries, 115 specialties. And one of the quite interesting things is that all the major regions, provinces, and cities, and even districts within cities in China have been given their task, the division of labor, to help carry out this initiative. Some of the strategic goals, basically by 2020, consolidate manufacturing power, incorporate more digital information technology into the process, master core technologies, and improve in terms of the efficiency and environmental outputs. By 2025, start bringing these up to moderately advanced levels, and having international competitiveness in a number of industrial clusters and a number of companies. Then by 2035, being a more advanced, improving innovation capability, making breakthroughs in innovation in key industries, making China more competitive and leveraging the sectors in which China is more competitive to become an innovation leader. And then finally, by 2049, again, the centennial of the People's Republic, the goal is to make China a truly advanced, if not world-leading manufacturing power. Now, there are a number of support policies. There are over 500 documents at national, regional, and local levels laying out what's being done all over the country. More than 500 smart industrial parks have been created or upgraded, along with many national demonstration zones. There are over 5,000 projects that are being supported. There are over 1,800 development funds that have been set up to support this initiative. Over 500 billion US dollars by our estimates have been directly and at the same time, perhaps an even greater amount of funds generated not directly from government sources, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Again, it's quite an enormous undertaking. In terms of who's involved in organizing and coordinating this initiative, basically everybody. It's coordinated through a small leading group of state council. That's the apex organ of the Chinese state. It includes local governments. It includes all of the major ministries and their sub-agencies. There are 10 targeted industries, everything from next generation IT, digital control, robotics, through electrical power equipment, new materials, biopharmaceuticals, high performance medical equipment, i.e., basically the 10 or so technologies widely viewed as the technologies of the future. One of the interesting and perhaps the most controversial point in the Made in China 2025 program involves the implementing regulations, which have set forth specific market share targets for Chinese companies to have in the domestic and international markets. Why are these controversial? Well, basically having market share targets that are supported directly through state intervention that serve to limit the share of foreign companies can be seen as a violation of both the spirit and the rules of the WTO. And in the 2025 program, you have a wide range of market share targets. I just list a few of them. Everything from having Chinese companies supplying 80% of domestic ICT equipment requirements by 2025 to a similar amount of advanced numerical control equipment, a similar amount of space information applications, to even greater percentage in terms of agricultural equipment, producing 80% of the key components for energy saving vehicles, and all the other ones on this page. And those are just the targets for national market share in the Chinese market. There is also a set of targets for Chinese penetration of global markets, in terms of ICT, in terms of fiber optics, in terms of computers, ships, etc. And as I said, the controversy that's emerged is that hard targets with state support run into all sorts of issues when it comes to international trade relations. Now, what are some of the outside views? The outside views is that this program reinforces the Chinese Communist Party and government control over the economy. It is a directive plan. It leveraged state intervention to alter markets. It has been providing massive direct financial support and indirect support through the signaling mechanism to other financing entities. And it also has provided for state support for acquisition of targeted technologies, bringing those to China, and then trying to substitute for the foreign sources of supply in those key technologies. And while other countries have supported development of key technologies, it's mostly through support for R&D and infrastructure. The level of direct support for specifics in terms of industrial parks, pilot projects by specific firms, acquisition of specific foreign companies, specific targets to displace foreign firms, etc. These are unprecedented. They are unprecedented in their scale, scope, and potential impact on global markets. According to the European Chamber of Commerce in China, they view it as an import substitution plan with staggering numbers applied, with hundreds of billions of euros of funding to change China's position in those markets. And the US Chamber of Commerce basically has said that an implementation of a plan like this is a decoupling mechanism. And this was before people in the US started talking about decoupling. And it views it as China's attempt to separate itself from the global economy in terms of source of supply for key technologies, while still penetrating global markets as a source of technology and products itself. Moving on, the digital Silk Road. Introduced in 2015 as a complement to the Belt and Road Initiative. It is the digital manifestation. It is the digital arm of the Belt and Road Initiative, designed to link the Belt and Road Initiative countries together with digital infrastructure, also to promote China's telecom equipment sector. And basically, the emphasis here has been increasing. Progress, the expected investment over a 10-year period was expected to be about 200 billion US, 79 billion of that had been committed by 2019. It's been a tremendous boon in supporting the internationalization of Chinese tech companies. And in many cases, loans are taken out for digital Silk Road Initiative projects. Loans come from Chinese sources and the funds go directly to the Chinese equipment suppliers without the funds ever leaving China. And again, there are many aspects of this. The flip side is that this is a way for many of the Belt and Road Initiative countries to obtain advanced infrastructure that they might not have been able to obtain otherwise. So it is not all take on the part of China, it is give as well. In terms of individual countries, India has been the largest destination so far of digital Silk Road projects, but we see multiple countries where well over $1 billion have been spent already. And again, some of this is grant, some of it is direct injection, but a lot of it is loans. What are some of the issues that have emerged? Again, as with Belt and Road Initiative, questions about whether some of the countries involved may get into debt issues. But there are also questions about control and access. Fears that the technology and the products and services will be used for surveillance, either on behalf of the local governments or on behalf of China itself. And in part, it's because the overseas capacity and capability does give China the ability potentially to route internet traffic, not only originating from Belt and Road countries through China, but also from any other country where the traffic happens to go through an internet node that's Chinese supplied throughout the Belt and Road Initiative countries. There's nothing new about that. I mean, Western governments have been accused of doing this for a while, but there are concerns in some quarters about the use of the information flows. And I'll just continue on. China Standards 2035, the last of the major initiatives I'll talk about, and the most recent. This was announced in 2020 after a 2-year research program by the Administration of Quality Supervision, Inspection and Quarantine. I won't even try to pronounce the acronym, and carried out by the Chinese Academy of Engineering. So when these initiatives come out, these are not whims. These come out after multi-year cross-agency, very, very detailed analysis, getting input from leading experts, not only from China, but from the rest of the world where that is feasible. Now, the China Standards Program is interesting, and again, like some of the other programs, multifaceted. Part of the plan is to upgrade Chinese industry through a focus on standards and meeting higher and higher product and service standards. But it's also a plan for China to be able to set or influence global standards for new technology areas such as 5G, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, etc. And those names should be familiar to you because, of course, those are also covered in the Made in China 2025 program and the Digital Silk Road initiative. Now, the China Standards 2035 initiative is based on a fact, and that is within China, local standards and compliance levels can vary enormously. So upping the game there is an unmitigated good for China's manufacturing economy, but also a desire to improve the quality of products, processes, and services, a view, and rightly, that historically that China hasn't had much of a say in standard setting bodies. It had to take the standards that others set. A long-standing goal to reduce the payments that China has to make to the holders of the technology that may underpin some of the foreign set standards, desire to break free of foreign dependence, and to help influence standards in a way that gives China an advantage in global competition. Now, are these objectives different from those that other nations have had? Answer no. The thing that's different is the concentrated resources behind the initiative compared to in other countries. What are some of the main steps? Improve adoption of uniform standards, again, within China. Also ensure that Chinese standards are used within China and eventually phase out the use of non-Chinese standards where that's feasible. To propagate Chinese standards through the Belt and Road, Digital Silk Road, etc. And in fact, many of the MOUs under Belt and Road Initiative require that products, goods, services supplied will meet the Chinese standards. Part of the goal also is to invest early in key technologies to help shape those standards so that Chinese practices and solutions are adopted globally. Okay, and this would help Chinese companies establish standards in emerging areas where China has market technology and application advantages. So those are the steps that are called for. And in the longer run, again, the founding documents of this program say in the longer run, basically first-class companies do standards, second-tier companies do technology, third-tier companies do products, and the same with countries. And the goal is to make China a first-tier country, participating not only in the production process, but in the technology through Made in China 2025 and in standards through the China Standards 2035 approach. And in the areas targeted, the global standards are still being formed, which gives China the opportunity to realize, and this is maybe an awkward quote from the Chinese into the English, the transcendence of Chinese industry and standards. What are the targeted areas? Basically everything, because it's both a domestic and an internationally oriented program. And of course, if we look on this page, we do see all of the key technologies of the future, be it intelligent transport to build smart cities, through satellite and space technology, through cloud computing, Internet of Things, blockchain, 5G, AI, into medical, biomedical, etc. So it is a comprehensive policy and program. But of course, we do have to insert the reality check. Regardless of China's program, Western companies are still the most influential on most international standards body. And China has not had a voice historically in those bodies consistent with the size of its economy. However, in most of the international standard setting bodies, it's the companies that are the leaders that are the participants rather than states getting directly involved or intervening directly. And if we think about it, if China were to use standard setting to try to influence companies in terms of access to the China market, it's difficult for them to push back if they want access to China. And of course, countries interested in investments, loans, or other investments from China for Belt and Road related infrastructure, digital Silk Road infrastructure, etc., they may have simply no choice than to adopt Chinese standards, not only for those goods and services, but perhaps throughout the entire economy. Early movers potentially can be decisive, and this is why we have to view this initiative as fundamentally linked to the Made in China 2025 initiative and Digital Silk Road. So even if China does not unilaterally set standards across the board, and nobody believes that that's going to happen, this program is likely to be extremely influential. And it will alter the competitive landscape in key technology areas. I'm not saying that is a good or bad. I'm just saying that that's what's going to happen. So when we start piecing these bits of the puzzle together, what do we see? We see that China's major economic initiatives represent a strategy of development and internationalism, but of asymmetric internationalism. So for example, the Belt and Road Initiative will couple Belt and Road Initiative economies to China through infrastructure links, through standard links, through trade and investment links, while potentially decoupling them and China from non-Belt and Road Initiative countries. Made in China 2025 couples to China countries that supply the resources and technology that China needs today, but potentially decouples China over time from foreign technology and inputs as soon as possible. Digital Silk Road, Internet Plus, other digital initiatives couple digital Silk Road economies to China's digital infrastructure. But remember, China's digital infrastructure is separate from the rest of the world's, with the Great Firewall of China. And there's the potential for the digital Silk Road to be able to be basically a China-run concentric ring around the closed Chinese system, potentially decoupling those countries from the rest of the world's underlying technology infrastructure. And similarly with the standards program, it couples to China companies that adopt China's standards, but potentially decouples them or sets up a situation where we could see a bifurcated world in some technologies. Then there are other details as well that I won't go into: the China payment system, the Chinese GPS system, and many, many others. It's the same. On the one hand, they endeavor to couple like-minded countries to China and its system and its standards, while potentially decoupling and setting up a rival to existing systems, reinforcing a two markets, two resources strategy. This is a strategy where there's a China domestic market, which needs to be leveraged for domestic and international advantage, and a foreign market within which China advantage is to be leveraged, and domestic resources which are supposed to be developed, and foreign resources which, where necessary, are to be imitated, substituted for acquired, or in some cases negated. So it's an asymmetric internationalism approach that is one of the links between all of these initiatives. Now, again, as I've said a few times, China's efforts throughout these initiatives are extremely logical. China is seeking to maximize its influence, development potential, and freedom of action, just like any other country would. Its strategy is comprehensive, it's integrated, it's creative, and it's adjusted as conditions warrant. So running up against an obstacle in a Belt and Road Initiative country or a digital Silk Road project, yes, that will happen, but then China adjusts. It learns, it sharpens the pencils, it does better due diligence, and does better projects going forward as a result. But the strategy of asymmetric internationalism and the concentration of state resources, that's created pushback. And it's really unprecedented in terms of what we've seen in the global economy. And that's leads us to questions about what the world economy is going to look like in 10 years' time and what foreign governments and companies should do. Now, for governments, you need to understand the totality. You can't understand one piece here, one piece there. You have to put all the pieces together. You have to think about the logical outcomes. You need to think about how desirable or acceptable those are. And if they're not desirable or acceptable, then you need to find a way to deal with and or negotiate with China. And China tends to negotiate, as I said in our first session, on the basis of countervailing economic power. That's what tends to determine negotiations with China. Otherwise, we should expect that they may be delayed, and they may not hit all the goals, but that China will hit many, if not most of the goals in these major initiatives. For companies, it's a bit different. They again need to understand the totality of the initiatives and the implications, in particular, how the company and its industries are affected, and whether the industries involved will have a single world, a bifurcated world, or a fragmented world in terms of market access, technology, and standards. Companies need to think about how to work with China, how to create win-win propositions where it can be good business for the company to work with one or more of China's initiatives, either inside or outside of China. But if there are no win-win solutions, then foreign companies have to figure out what can we succeed in, how do we invest to do that, and if we think that the government support coming out of China is unfair, then how does that get counted? The major initiatives will change the world. The key questions that we don't know the answer to are how soon, and how the rest of the world will respond. And as always, when it comes to China, fortune favors the informed and the prepared. So let me just conclude my prepared remarks by reminding everybody we have three further sessions in the series scheduled. March 17 on urban and regional development. That's a change in the schedule. Then April 14th on China's 14th five-year program, and May 12th on the challenge for Chinese companies going public in the US. And with that, let me thank you all for your patience and open it up for questions and commentary. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. We have about 12 minutes. So I'm going to try to pick at least one question in each of the key topic areas. And maybe if you can't give us a comprehensive answer, you can touch on the highlights so we can try to cover 3 or 4 questions. One of the questions has to do with what some of the obstacles could be to the success of the BRI program, especially from a diplomatic perspective. You touched on it, but there's interest in getting to know a little bit more about how you see this playing out in the future.
Okay, well, there are a number of potential obstacles. One of the first obstacles is a question that's never asked and answered. And that is, if all this infrastructure is so wonderful and if it's economically justified, then why hasn't anybody made the investment to date? In other words, if these projects were bankable, why hasn't somebody banked them?
Mhm.
And one potential answer is that they're not bankable, and some of them may not be. Another potential answer is that if you look at it, maybe some of the projects are only bankable if they're part of a network. And China's the only one that can coordinate the network just given the geographies. Or another potential answer is that maybe Chinese entities are willing to take below market returns that others won't have. But this is a question that, as I said, whenever my clients, I have governments and companies that I work with on this, whenever they're looking at a project, I always say, why hasn't the project been done? If it hasn't been bankable, what about Belt and Road makes it bankable? So that's one. A second is that on the diplomatic side, it cuts both ways because there are some countries which are seeing investments that they would not have seen without the Belt and Road Initiative. And for them, this is a good thing. It helps develop their economies. For a country like the US, some of the fears are that that Belt and Road countries will get into debt problems and then run to the World Bank or the IMF for emergency relief, or that China will come to dominate these countries and there'll be some loss of sovereignty. Those risks are there. And within the countries, they have to make their own decisions. And within other countries like the US, like Japan, who have proposed alternatives, part of the impetus for them has got to be, well, if not Belt and Road, then what's the alternative, right? So there is pushback. China understands that, is adjusting based on that, and is still moving forward.
Just a clarification, a quick clarification here on the interest rates on these loans, because as you say, most of it is debt. And how does it compare in terms of the kind of lending you would get from the World Bank if you were getting a soft loan versus commercial rates? Do we know what the rates are like that the countries are borrowing at?
There are some projects where that is known and publicly disclosed, and
Hmm.
there's some that's not.
Hmm.
Um, and in essence, while the claim is that these are commercially viable projects, the funding mechanisms, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, is set up to be a multilateral on the model of a World Bank. So they're not charging full commercial rates. Then you also have something like the Silk Road Investment Fund, which is an equity fund run by the Chinese government, which has its own returns criteria. So I think that the answer is there's a spectrum
Mhm.
that you should think of somewhere between very concessionary and something below market as the loan rates.
Mhm.
And as I said, projects have seen their financing restructured. It is not China's goal to go in and make loans that can't be repaid, and therefore China takes the position in the assets, because even China can't fund that. So again, it's a range. It's a range, but think at least semi-concessionary finance.
Okay. Now, switching now to the Made in China program, uh, one of the questions asks if you would comment further on the Chinese approach to targeting of key technologies. How is that actually operationalized, and what is the role of state-owned companies in that process?
It is operationalized through national mobilization. And what does that mean? It means hundreds of new industrial parks built by a combination of central government and state, provincial or municipal government funds, with key digital infrastructure supplied by Chinese companies, again, often funded either by governments or through having relatively favorable contractual terms for the suppliers. Then companies going into these parks that are in targeted sectors can get employment grants. they can get tax breaks, they can get training funds, they can get government-financed pilot R&D projects that help them develop commercializable products and services. They can get state support for investigating overseas markets, for acquiring, if necessary, foreign technology, etc. It is comprehensive. And so one of the things for any company operating in China, both foreign and local, is, hey, are we in anything that qualifies us for some of the subsidies or concessionary finance? Because finance is rationed in China. And the big state banks preferentially lend to programs, projects, initiatives, companies that can identify themselves as part of one of these major initiatives.
In the US, there's a strong feeling that the government cannot pick winners and losers. This whole scheme looks like a giant version of trying to do precisely that. How is it that China is able to pull that off?
Well, one of the things that's quite interesting is China is picking technologies and industries.
Hmm.
And it is not necessarily picking a single winner
Hmm.
or a preferred company. And in fact, throughout these various initiatives, the word market, market, market comes up repeatedly. But what market means in the context is market competition among Chinese entities, all taking advantage of these programs and then competing with each other to
Hmm.
figure out who has the best solution. Now, that's not the case in every sector, but it's the case in the majority of the sectors. And the big state-owned enterprises increasingly are just in the commanding heights of the economies. So the telecom companies, yeah, they're part of the initiative, but they're acting as sophisticated buyers supporting multiple players in their developments and then trying to pick and choose the best suppliers to have the most advanced telecom infrastructure and backbones.
Hmm. The question about what you think the penalties will be for China of violating some of the WTO rules and commitments, for instance, by having market share targets.
That's very interesting because the problem is that if this were to be taken to the WTO, it's not one WTO case, it's 5,000 WTO cases. And typically, a WTO case takes on average 3 to 4 years for a first adjudication, with then the potential for appeals that can go on beyond that. And in roughly a third of all the cases brought to the WTO, no finding is ultimately made. Now, having said that, when findings have been made by a WTO dispute authority and it's gone through the appeals process, China has tended to honor those judgments very, very scrupulously. The trouble is, think about Made in China 2025. It was a 10-year program. By the time you get anything adjudicated, most of the 10 years is up. China says, okay, yes, for this industry, for this technology, we'll stop subsidizing. The damage is already done. So it is a very challenging circumstance. The last US administration, its response was for the president to use the tariff powers that the president has under existing US trade law. And regardless of what the justification was given, the real justification was to combat Made in China 2025. And we don't know what the current administration will do. In Europe, part of the response was to have a much more detailed investigation process before technology investments from China were accepted. And the US, the EU, and Japan, it's not well known, but in January of 2020, the US, the EU, and Japan signed a joint communique calling on the World Trade Organization to substantially beef up its rules and its enforcement power against state-sponsored industrialization.
Hmm. We've got about a minute left. Michael, I want you to com comment on the way you characterize the China strategy, which I think is very interesting, asymmetrical internationalism. And it's now become clear, and as you pointed out, it wasn't obvious when China set out on this journey of sort of integrating into the global economy and becoming a member of the WTO and so on, that this was the path China would take. But now the world is sort of woken up to this and recognizes, starting to recognize what is happening, even if not completely the scale and the dimensions of it as you've laid out. Given that the world is now starting to push back, how do you think China will respond to the pushback over the next 10, 15 years?
Well, it's quite interesting. The Made in China 2025 program went for about a year and a half before first actually European companies and then US companies and then governments first in Europe and the US started to respond. What has China done as a result? What China has done is it has basically stopped using the term Made in China 2025. It has soft pedaled the numerical targets, calling them non-binding indicators. And basically, the high level discussion of that, I mean, it wasn't Made in China 2025, was not even in the summary work report that the premier submitted for 2019. But the 5,000 projects are still going full bore.
Mm-hmm.
With Belt and Road, China is, as I said, in the first days of Belt and Road, anybody who could call a project a Belt and Road project seemed to be able to get money to finance it, whether they were good projects or not. Now the scrutiny is much, much sharper. In order to get approval for funding from even concessionary Chinese sources, you have to do a lot of due diligence on the project. It's a much more sophisticated approach because China understood it was getting a bad rap because of some of the debt issues. On the other hand, issues of surveillance and access to information, China is basically silent on that and is not going to react to pressure from the rest of the world. And that's one of the questions is what does the rest of the world do? And it's not only about these initiatives. I see in the chat people have brought up a number of other issues, human rights, etc. And the key question becomes, are you going to deal with China, yes or no? And if the answer is yes, then the question is how. And those of us from the rest of the world, we need to, retain our values and perspectives. But what are we going to do becomes the question.
Mm-hmm.
And if one is going to deal with China, one is going to be dealing with these various initiatives. And one is going to be dealing with a state actor with a very coordinated, integrated, creative strategy. A lot of the aspects of the strategy, as I said before, are no different from what many other countries would do if they could. The difference is the amount of resources that are being put in place. And that's what creates the conundrum. Because if this is different from the pre-existing economic order, the question is, how is that economic order going to change? And whether other countries have to change the way they operate in order to either match or to deal with this integrated strategy.
Terrific. I think that's two big questions to think about. First, I think I take away is we may be trying to close the barn door after the horse is already out. And so then the question is, how do you deal with the fact the horse is already out of the barn? And it requires a lot of careful thinking for the rest of the world to figure out how to coexist with China's strategy. I think, yeah.
Yes, but it's not inevitable. Again, a lot of these things are going to happen. It's not inevitable that China rules the world. If we think about economics and the economic power of nations, yes, China's GDP may eventually pass that of the US. It's likely to. But if you take Western Europe, the US, Japan, Australia, India, you know, even just the US plus the EU will have a combined economy far larger than China's for as long as I'm going to be professionally active and beyond. So it is a matter of understanding. First, you got to understand. If we can't understand, we can't do
Right.
anything.
Right.
So we first have to understand, then we have to filter through, and we have to also understand that China can be negotiated with, but it needs to be negotiated with, in very specific terms in order to create a situation in which both the Western and Chinese systems coexist, interact. There'll be areas of potential agreement, there'll be areas of disagreement, and that's not the end of the world. So it's not an either or. It's an item by item, detail by detail discussion that needs to take place within other countries, between other countries, and then between countries and China.
As you said, the first step is understanding what's happening. And I think that's the main purpose of this series of events on the China Insight series. And certainly we're getting a lot of useful insights, Michael. Thank you again for doing this. I think you might want to remind them when the next event is on the March 17th, and maybe again remind everyone what the topic is.
It will be on unleashing urbanization and regional development in China. Within China, there have been massive investments that are reshaping the way cities and provinces interact with each other, the way they function in economic terms. So one of the questions or comments, or one of the questions was, could we expand more on urbanization in China? That is the major, or one of the major topics of the March 17 presentation.
Okay, terrific. Thank you again, Michael. Thank you, Magda, for setting this up. Thank you all in the audience for your participation, and we hope to see you again in March. Good night and goodbye.